it might not have escaped your notice that today is a family service, so it will be a bit shorter. I'm very pleased that we're ahead of schedule. I'll try not to disrupt that because I've been told we're trying to keep it to an hour. We've got lunch afterwards, so I will try not to keep people too long. It will be a bit interactive. Bear with me at the beginning, boys and girls. I've got a wee bit of a run-up, but then it will get interactive, okay? Now, I know it's a bit random that we're talking about Psalm 23 at the beginning of Advent. It didn't actually occur to me. We're still in November. I mean, what is all this Christmas stuff? But apparently it's the beginning of Advent, despite the fact that we're in November. 30th of November. But Sorry?
St. Andrew's Day.
St. Andrew's Day as well. Oh, wow. There you go. I don't think I can work that into the theme quite. But yeah, when Gary, I think it was Gary had asked, could I speak? I was thinking, I'm about to finish my job. I've been working in my job. I've been working in East Lothian Council for 20 years and in my job for 13. And I'm about to wrap it up. I've got 1 week left. And I was thinking, when I move to this new council, Five Council, I mean, I don't know about that, but, I'm going to work for Five Council. I'm not sure that I'll be up for having the headspace to talk. So Gary asked, and I said, yeah. And I thought, what could I talk about? Because I was told it was kind of relatively open. And I had a sense about Psalm 23. So I'm hoping that there's something in here for all of us today, because I really feel there's been a couple of wee things that have happened that have confirmed, I feel, that God wants to say something to us through Psalm 23. So last week we were hearing about Christ the King. For anyone that was here, Mike Parker was talking about that. And today we're going to be talking about a song or a poem that was written by a king who still recognised that he needed a shepherd. And I've just realised I don't need this mic if I've got this one. Is that right, Gary? Yeah, I can just... No, I do need this mic. Okay. So the words that he wrote are possibly the most well-known words in the Old Testament. And following the God is theme, we're going to be thinking about the fact that God is our shepherd, because we've been thinking, I think, having been through a bit of a difficult time as a church, we have been thinking about the character and nature of God, and I felt it was important to continue that. So Psalm 23 was written by King David, and before he was a king, I think most of the boys and girls know this, he was a shepherd. So he knows a lot about being a shepherd, and he also knows a lot about sheep. And I think it's really interesting that he compares us people to sheep, and he compares God to a shepherd. Sheep are mentioned over 500 times in the Bible. That's more than any other animal, and at least 40 of those references are comparing us, people, to sheep. I'm thinking, why out of all the animals did God pick sheep? The actual alternative talk from my talk to this morning, the alternative title, was Sheep Are Really Daft. They're not very clever. They need to be led. They're not able to navigate. There was a bit of debate in our house this week about whether dogs can navigate, but apparently, dogs can navigate to some extent. As maybe some can't, but if they get lost, some of them can find their way home from quite long distances. Our cat certainly can get herself back home. Birds migrate across continents. Salmon know to swim upstream. Sheep don't cope very well at all if they're left to their own devices. In fact, I heard a story about a sheep this is true, about a sheep that jumped off a cliff in Turkey. Would you like to hazard a guess as to how many sheep jumped after it? Any guesses? 4? Quite a lot. Anyone like 20?
The other 99.
99? 1,500 sheep jumped off that cliff. 400 of them died. The other 1,100 were apparently protected because they jumped afterwards. It cost the shepherd, now this is true, you can Google it, because I did, and I've got a screenshot on my phone, it happened in Turkey. £42,000 it cost. Just because one little sheep thought, I wonder what's over there. And it went. So I do wonder if it's because we need to be led that we're compared to sheep. Because we really do need to be led. So this morning I need a few sheep. Just little ones. So I'm wondering if children could come, the boys and girls, could you come to the front? Could you maybe stand over there just behind where Dulcie is? Okay. Now, the other thing is I need a shepherd. Oh, I'm in luck. There's one lurking at the back there. How handy. So sheep, you have one job. One job. Follow the shepherd, okay? Where he goes, you go, okay? Now, I know the adults like a 3-point sermon, so this morning we're going to talk about the shepherd's direction, protection and provision. So firstly, we're looking at direction. As I said, sheep do need to be led. So let's see how well they can do at following the shepherd. So starting in verse 1, we read, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." Yes, here's your green pastures. Now, don't go looking over there at the other grass. It says, "I shall not want."
Don't look at this.
Don't look at the other grass. We've to be content with the pasture that the shepherd has led us to. Sometimes the shepherd needs to give us a little encouragement to stay in our pasture.
There you
Struan, I said to Struan he had to be a naughty sheep. He didn't really like the idea of being a naughty sheep. This led on to a discussion about how it says in the Bible, we all like sheep have gone astray. I said, we're all naughty sheep, really. So it's quite tricky, not just for you boys and girls, but for adults too, because we're always looking around us, aren't we? If in our house, if only I had the Nintendo Switch 2. Nintendo is not enough, it has to be the Nintendo Switch 2. If only I was allowed as much screen time as my friends. It's not just the kids though, is it? If only I had a better job, if only I didn't have to commute to East Lothian, if only I had a bigger house, if only I were able to go on holiday. We're so tempted to look at other circumstances. If only I had the gifting that that person had. But God wants us not to look to the other pastures. He wants us to be thankful for what we have and be able to say, I shall not want. And the next thing we see is he makes me lie down. So sheep, the shepherd wants you to lie down.
Thanks, kids.
But I wonder how we apply this today. God doesn't want us to actually start lying down in fields, does he? What we do have is a picture of sheep that are supposed to be resting. This is actually very handy. The shepherd knows that sometimes we need to rest, and in our lives we've got people that help us, our mummies and daddies, say it's time to go to sleep. They know it's good for us to get a good night's sleep. But I think God doesn't want us to just rest our bodies. I think he also wants us to rest our mind. Now, sheep, I want you to take something that the shepherd is giving you that some of you might have already taken. So, shepherd, would you like to give your sheep?
Too late.
Too late. Has everyone got something, have they? Okay. So, I wonder if... can you hold up in the air what you've got from your shepherd? Okay. Now... Maybe instead of he makes me lie down, it could be he makes me put down my phone. Has anyone got a phone? Can you put it back in the box? Anyone that's got a phone? Or it might be he makes me put down my gaming controller. Who's got a gaming controller? Can you put it back in the box? Or he makes me put down my tablet. Oh, I think nobody's got the tablet, that's fine. Or can anyone who has a remote control put it down as well? He makes me put down my remote control. So this is one way we can rest. We can disconnect from technology. Now, this lesson isn't just for the kids. Would anyone like to hazard a guess as to, on average, according to a recent study, how many times people touch their phone a day? 2,617. That was an iPhone, but it's shocking, isn't it? Really shocking.
I was thinking 2,000.
You were thinking 2,000. You're in the ballpark there. And I learned recently on a seminar that I was on that an inability to stop cycling from one activity to another, doom scrolling, can actually be a trauma response and a way of dealing with things we need to deal with, dealing with inner pain. And it's tempting to think that we're resting, if we're scrolling on social media or watching TV or gaming. But is our mind still busy? Are we really resting? Graham wrote a poem, which might have been better received than the one you gave last year. I don't know, Merimnatetesike, have I pronounced that right?
Yeah.
Good. Merimnao is the Greek word used in Matthew 6:34, where Jesus is saying, don't worry. And what he's talking about with worry... Oh, I've got a wee sheep escaping. The word worry or the word that's used for worry or anxious, Miriam, now, stems from two root words, one of which is divide or separate and one of which is mind. So when we're worrying, as implied by the word's component, we have a divided mind, a state where our attention is pulled in different directions, causing distraction and inner conflict. So it's important not to get our minds divided, boys and girls, not to let them be fragmented or shredded. And how often do I feel my phone is pulling me away or shredding my mind? And instead of being in this state of divided mind, the shepherd is calling us. In fact, more than that, he wants to lead us to exactly the opposite of this. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So at this point, little sheep, the shepherd is going to...
Go in the water. Beside the water, please.
So at this point, my little sheep, the shepherd is going to give you something to do that might help you to quieten your mind. More than watching TV or playing a video game, you're going to do some anti-stress colouring in. Actually, these colouring sheets, some of them come from a book that says anti-stress colouring in. And I know there's a bit of a trend even for adults of these books that can just help us to, colour in very, very detailed. So that's what the boys and girls are going to be doing for the next... maybe Thomas, maybe he's a little bit too young to be doing the colouring in, I think, maybe. So I think it's really important to notice that from a place of resting our bodies and minds, we are then able to be led, because it says he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake, but that's after the quiet waters. And this is actually the reason that I decided to talk about Psalm 23 today, because I was listening to a podcast discussion between two American Christian pastors, Tyler Staton and John Mark Comer, on being still. And I was so struck by it. Tyler Staton says he's starting to think of a quiet inner life as being the canvas on which God paints his masterpieces. And yet they talk about how we are living in a culture that does almost nothing to cultivate a quiet inner life within us, and almost everything to clutter our inner lives. Now, if we don't intentionally cultivate a practice of silence, we have to ask, what impact is this having on our spiritual lives? John Mark Comer quotes Henri Nouwen, who says quite bluntly, without solitude, it's virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. That really challenged me. It really jumped out at me when I listened to that. And, this week, Leslie sent me a talk by a completely different person who had the same quote in there, that very same phrase. And it's like that underlining, God is saying, yes, you need to hear this. Without solitude, it's virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. It can look very good from the outside, but actually, what is the substance if we're not connecting? And I want to share another picture that I had. So when I sit down to read my Bible, how often I rush in and I think, I'm going to do my quiet time. And this is true. This is how I read my Bible. I've been rushing around. I run into the conservatory, almost running really. I sit down with my Bible in a year. And I think, right, what day am I on? Right, read my passage. And then I quite often use the acronym ACTS, Adoration, Confession, Thanksgiving, Supplication, to pray. And I think I find that easy because it's something solid that I can kind of go through. And then I say, bye, God. It's another thing ticked off my daily list. But did I really connect? Did I stop to listen? Did I really come to the quiet waters? Because if I didn't, can I be led in the paths of righteousness? And is what I'm going to do after that of any substance? Now, God gave me a very specific picture. I was listening to the talk that Leslie gave me, and one of the things the guy was talking about was shooting arrows. And for some reason, it brought to mind that sport that I got into for some reason during the last Winter Olympics, which is the one where they ski really, really fast, and then they stop and they shoot. I don't know if anyone's seen this, but the next day, Struan and I were watching Bridge of Lies, because Struan's really getting into quiz shows, And I found out this is called a biathlon. And again, it was like an underlining that suddenly out of nowhere, I never knew what this sport was called. And it's a question on the Bridge of Lies. And I think that's what I'm trying to do. I'm going really, really fast, 100 miles an hour. And I'm coming in and I'm trying to shoot that. And it's really hard. And it's like, no, this is not the way God wants you to be connecting with him. He's wanting you to slow down your rhythms altogether. But one of the reasons it's so difficult to slow down and be still is because many of us are in a performance-related mindset. And if we're silent before God, if we're not even speaking, if we're not bringing anything, we're naked before him. There's nothing we're bringing. We're coming empty-handed to receive from him. Now, I had the briefest of chats with Mike Parker, who spoke last week. And so wise, that man, in 2 minutes, just so much that he downloaded. He gave me some amazing insights into this psalm. One of the things he told me was about watching a group of shepherds. There was thousands of sheep milling about and group of shepherds when he was in the Middle East. I'm not sure if it was Egypt. I know he spent some time in Egypt. There were so many sheep mingling around, and he was just thinking, this looks like chaos. How are they going to separate the sheep? And then he said, one of the shepherds got up and went, and immediately that shepherd's sheep followed him. They knew his voice. And I think for me, this is a challenge. Am I cultivating the conditions in my life that I'm able to hear that? Or is my inner life so decluttered? I counted the WhatsApp messages this morning, 20 I had before coming to church this morning. That was by 10 to 10, 20 WhatsApp messages. I don't know how to cope with this because I don't want to come off WhatsApp, but this is cluttering. So I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. Anyone that does, please come and see me after the service. It's so important that I'm giving this because of everyone in this church, of us all. I think I need to know this more than anyone. And I think it's really all the more important as we enter this busy season of Advent that we take time to be still. Maybe just 1 minute a day initially. And some of the talks I've listened to have said, if you do that, if you just sit down and be still, don't expect amazing results at first. In fact, you might get a torrent of thoughts that flood in because everything that you've been suppressing during your busyness is going to come out. But he says, go with it. Because if we can be disciplined and do this on a regular basis, if we can create quiet spaces on a daily basis, it should start to affect the rhythms of our lives so that we're going at a steady pace rather than doing that biathlon that I'm trying to run. There's a couple of books I would really like to recommend. One is The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And John Mark Comer, he draws largely on the work of Dallas Willard in identifying that hurry is a massive enemy that we don't recognize, but it's a massive enemy to our spiritual lives. And then this old classic that some of you might know, The Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster, is brilliant, and it's got some great words on stillness, solitude, fasting, and just creating those rhythms and discipline in our lives. So next we're going to talk about protection, and my little sheep are going to be on the move again. So we need a shepherd. The sheep have had a lie down, they've had some grass, they've had some water, and now they're going to go into the valley. Why? So sheep, do you want to follow your shepherd? Shepherd, you need to lead.
Sheepies. Gather round.
The valley's that way, shepherd. So why would the shepherd take them away? Oh, you're going the wrong way. You're going backwards, shepherd. Why would the shepherd take them away from their lovely green pastures and the beautiful quiet waters into the valley? Well, you see, in the Middle East, where David was a shepherd, he knows that when it gets really hot, the sheep need the shade of the valley, where often the greenest pastures are, because they can't... I'm losing the plot here. The sheep are distracting me. So the sheep need the shade of this valley because the greenest pastures are there because the waters run down from the hills. But the sheep don't like going into the valley because they can't see very well. They need the shepherd to guide them. They need to trust in him. The valley is an essential part of the journey precisely because the sheep can't see very well, and it forces them to rely on the shepherd. And we were reminded by Ronnie a couple of weeks ago of that verse in Hebrews 11. Now, faith is the confidence in what we hope for, an assurance about what we do not see. So when our physical sight is stripped away from us, we develop faith, and we develop our spiritual sight through dependence on the shepherd. Notice the proclamation, I will fear no evil, because the shepherd is with them, and he's going to help them navigate the steep path, and he'll protect them from anything lurking in the shadows. The shepherd has his long staff, which is for guiding, and you saw him hooking the sheep back, but he also has a rod, which Graham spent a lot of time crafting. I'm not sure where the rod is. Do you have your rod? Do you want to show people your rod? The rod is to protect the sheep from anything lurking in the shadows. Here's the rod. It's maybe a bit thinner normally, but we like this handcrafted rod.
Oh, it's amazing what you can do with an old privet hedge.
Oh, I've got the rod.
You could pop it over there when you're done.
Okay, so the rod. We see an interesting thing happening in verse 4, because up to now, David has referred to the shepherd in the third person. He said, he makes me lie down. He leads me beside. He restores my soul. But suddenly in verse 4, in the valley we read, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. There's greater intimacy that comes from being in the valley. Sometimes it's about being in a place where everything we're inclined to trust in apart from God is stripped away. Another interesting thing about valleys, when we see them, no two valleys are alike. Our little sheep are already through the valley because the shepherd knew that they were little and he didn't want them to stay too long in the valley in case they were spooked. And we often see that with young Christians. They go through a tiny little tribulation or trial and, they're full of, and everything that was happening. But actually we know, as those of us that have been Christians for a long time, that there are different valleys. Sometimes there are very long valleys. Sometimes we're intensely aware of God's presence when we're in the midst of difficult circumstances. But some of us have experienced the valley as a place of deathly, eerie stillness where we cannot feel God at all. Some mystics have described this as the dark night of the soul. And you can read about that in Richard Foster's book. It's a phrase initially coined by St. John of the Cross. And sometimes, if we've been through a very traumatic set of circumstances or bereavement, we can be in that place of numbness, and it can go on not just for days or weeks, but for months and maybe even years. And it is difficult to trust God in those times, but we need to trust him. We literally put one foot in front of another and we walk through. And I think when we're in this valley, it's really important not to take on board condemnation about not feeling close to God. And I think particularly when we, in our charismatic, tradition, we expect to feel, we don't always feel. And sometimes God has a purpose in that. He's not looking for warm and fuzzy feelings in the valley. This isn't about the green pastures or the still waters. God just asks us to keep our eyes on the shepherd and follow him, and he will lead us in the valley. It's really important as well that we don't turn into Job's comforters when we see others in the valley and start giving, it's good to encourage and it's good to pray, but I think we have to recognise if someone is in this place, not to add on any condemnation that they might already be adding on to themselves. Now, the most likely location, there's a few possible locations, but one of the most likely locations for the Valley of the Shadow of Death is the Kidron Valley, which is behind Jerusalem. It's the valley that David had to travel through when he's being chased by his son Absalom, who was trying to take over the kingdom, and he wanted to kill David. That's described in 2 Samuel 15, verse 23. And I do wonder, when David's writing this psalm, is he thinking of that experience, which literally could have been physical death, but it wasn't. It was the shadow of death. The Kidron Valley is full of graves, which is on the picture there, the top picture. So people are surrounded by reminders of death. They are not dying, but death is all around. It's a very deep valley, so even when Jerusalem is lit up for a festival, the valley stays in shadow. Now, interestingly, the Garden of Gethsemane is in the Kidron Valley. The psalm written 1400 years before Jesus' birth prophetically points to the defeat of evil in this valley. And we also see a prophetic pointing in the next 2 verses where the psalm talks about God's provision. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now the children are already at their table, but we haven't surrounded them with enemies. They're just decorating sheep biscuits, which you might see later on at lunch. I think it's interesting that God is supplying our needs, not in a place where there's no conflict. We're in the presence of our enemies when the table's prepared for us. And I think for me, that reminded me of the Last Supper, where Jesus ate in the presence of Judas. And then we read, you anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. I love the abundance that we see here that Ronnie touched on a couple of weeks ago. So the head is anointed with oil, is the custom in the Middle East when you're welcoming a guest. And the cup is overflowing. It's not a 125 ml measure. It's literally overflowing. And again, Ronnie reminded us that we've got a drive to feed ourselves, but Jesus is offering us a different path. It's not about being in control. I mean, my morning this morning, we nearly left the still waters at home. Had to go back for them, always trying to be in control. But it's not about that. God wants us to relinquish the control. And as Ronnie reminded us, we need our spiritual eyes opened in order to be able to see his provision. Because if our spiritual eyes aren't opened and we don't see the provision, then we'll try and provide for ourselves. And then lastly, we see this beautiful prophetic proclamation. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That is the glorious future that awaits us. Now, recently I was telling a friend about that dream that I had a couple of months ago. That dream that I had where I felt every atom in my body was literally 3D, and that I was moving through time and space, and I've never felt so alive. And this friend said, what do you think God was trying to tell you through that dream? And I really think it was an invitation, because God knows how hard I find it to be still and how easy I turn to Netflix instead of to God. Still, I don't know how many times I've mentioned that when I'm at the front. I find it so hard to be still. I find it much easier to do that performative thing of reading my Bible and saying a prayer, and I've had my time with God. But I just feel this is an invitation for all of us, but definitely for me. Don't miss this call to connect with God and to be still. And it's so important in this busy season. And I know, maybe December's not the best time to start this, but I think God wants us to start thinking, how can we create that space in our lives to really connect with him? So thanks for listening. We're going to enjoy our own banquet later on when we have our lunch. I hope everyone's able to stay for the lunch. But now I'm going to hand back to Steve, who's going to